Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name's Owen Johnston. I'm Partnerships Manager at the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Centre. We're just going to give people sort of one more minute to join as people are coming in now, and then we'll get started. So I'm not going to say too much by way of introduction today before turning over to our two speakers, but the topic for today's lunchtime seminar is identifying child criminal exploitation in Northern Ireland. This is a research project that recently completed that looked at barriers to the identification and recognition of that issue in Northern Ireland. It's been a really interesting project, and I'm really looking forward to hearing our two speakers present the findings. So we have Dr. Gillian Kane, who's a lecturer at Ulster University School of Law, and whose research expertise lies in international migration law. But Gillian's work looks at the intersections between various international legal frameworks governing migration, as well as researching the role of international law in addressing human trafficking in the context of forced migration, as well as in the context of child criminal exploitation in Northern Ireland. And our other speaker is Andrew Tism, a senior project associate with IOM UK, who leads on their work in Northern Ireland, working primarily on human trafficking research and programming. Prior to that, Andrew worked with IOM Ireland in several roles, including managing the Ukraine response. And before that, Andrew worked with international nonprofits on issues including refugee resettlement, destitution, and modern slavery. So I'm going to hand over to Gillian and Andrew now for about 15 minutes. Then I'll come back and we will take all your questions for the Q&A portion of the chat. So Gillian, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Owen and the team at the PEC. As Owen mentioned, my name is Gillian. I'm a lecturer at Ulster University School of Law, and I'm joined by my colleague Andrew, who is from the International Organization for Migration. And today we are going to speak about our recently finished project on identifying modern slavery and human trafficking in the context of child criminal exploitation in Northern Ireland. And this research was co-commissioned and co-funded by the Northern Ireland Department of Justice and the Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Centre, who are hosting the seminar today. And so I'll hand over to my colleague Andrew to introduce the problem.
Thanks, Gillian. So just moving on to the problem. So in recent years across Northern Ireland, there has been increasing acknowledgement of the need to understand child criminal exploitation and the nature of harms that contribute to it. The criminal exploitation of children has transitioned from an emerging concern to an increasing policy priority throughout the UK. And against this backdrop, key Northern Ireland government departments have taken action, most notably with the recent launch of a cross-departmental, multi-agency 2-year action plan to address the issue, as well as an agreed definition of child criminal exploitation. The National Referral Mechanism then is the UK's framework for formally identifying and referring potential victims of modern slavery. And on the next slide, we have some statistics which show the increase in the number of children being referred to the NRM in Northern Ireland, most notably, however, from those reporting exploitation taking place overseas. And since records began in 2014 until the end of 2024, 9,415 UK male children have been referred to the NRM specifically for criminal exploitation. In comparison, only 4 children have been referred for criminal exploitation in Northern Ireland, and there has never been a UK or Irish male child referred to the NRM in Northern Ireland to the end of 2024. And so it is within that context that we developed the overall aim of the study, which is to assess and enhance the understanding of why, given the increased focus on addressing harms experienced by children in the context of criminal exploitation, the formal identification of modern slavery and human trafficking within the NRM is largely absent. Just on to the next slide, one, please.
Thanks. Yeah, just on this slide, in terms of why we did this, we wanted these barriers to understand these barriers to identification so that we can make recommendations that would assist in removing these barriers and moving to see more formal identification of modern slavery and human trafficking. And we'll explain in a few minutes why identification is so crucial. But if we move on to the next slide, then in terms of how we went about doing this. We used a range of methods, which included reviewing international and domestic law and policy, conducting a survey. We had 43 stakeholders participate from a range of organisations and sectors, including law enforcement, health and social care, NGOs, and more. And we also conducted interviews with participants based in both Northern Ireland, but also more broadly in Great Britain. And we analysed all of this data to explore what these barriers to identification might be, exploring what the law requires, how domestic law has implemented international obligations, and what the understanding and knowledge is among first responders and others working in child protection, where people face challenges, and so on. So moving on to the next slide then, before we look at the findings, I want to briefly clarify on the terminology and then set out how international law defines human trafficking and why identification of this conduct is so crucial. So first, modern slavery, what is it? Well, in the UK, it's used as an umbrella term encompassing human trafficking, slavery, servitude, and forced labour, although it's not specifically defined in international law. Human trafficking is, though, and we'll get to that in a moment, but in the UK it's also defined in statute and falls within this overarching concept of modern slavery. But it's often characterised alongside it, so we often hear about modern slavery and human trafficking, or MSHT, and because of this we use the term modern slavery and human trafficking, but we also acknowledge that human trafficking is one of these harms that falls within the UK's umbrella concept. Now, in the report, we outline the definitions of slavery, servitude, and forced labour, and we point out that while some criminal exploitation may fall within the forced labour definition, and as such within the scope of modern slavery, it might not be the case for all of it. Well, what about human trafficking? Well, it's defined in international law under the Palermo Protocol and under the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking. And we can see on the next slide that there are three main elements. The act, so recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring, receipt. The means, so threat or use of force, but also more subtle coercive means, including the abuse of power or a position of vulnerability. And the purpose, exploitation, which is defined as at a minimum, meaning that this list that you see is non-exhaustive. The key is exploitation. And importantly, when it comes to children, only the act and the purpose elements need to be present. In other words, recruitment of children for the purpose of exploitation is human trafficking. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important as there are a number of obligations incumbent upon the state to prevent conduct falling within this definition and to protect those who've experienced harm within this definition. And if we look at the next slide, while we don't have time to go through all the obligations, I want to just highlight two main points. The first one is identification of human trafficking specifically is a standalone obligation within the Council of Europe Convention. But second, identification of modern slavery and human trafficking is key to accessing the protections contained within a range of additional obligations. None of these protection obligations can be complied with without identification, and really because of that, identification is crucial. And with that in mind, let's briefly turn to our findings. So if we move to the next slide and then the next one again. First, we explored the impact of Northern Ireland's unique context. We identified two elements of this unique context. So first, the societal context, and then the unique devolution arrangements in place. Regarding the societal context, one of our participants stated, we have conditions and levels of trauma, for instance, that condition communities and individuals in a way that just don't exist in other parts of the UK. And they said it's just a reality, no matter how difficult those other parts have it. And we know this. What we were interested in is how this plays out exactly when it comes to identifying child criminal exploitation and then understanding this as modern slavery and human trafficking. You can see here on the graph that among our survey respondents, when asked if they do encounter or have been made aware of child criminal exploitation, what forms of exploitation has that been in relation to? 79% selected paramilitary activity and 98%, all but one, selected drugs. We find that harm and exploitation here in Northern Ireland is often hyperlocal and familial. It could occur in the same street or even in the child's home, and it can be normalised. In addition, other scholars have noted that paramilitaries and organised criminal groups are sometimes trusted as those protecting communities. Alongside that, we know that we have unique devolution arrangements here that are not without complexity. We have a mandatory coalition which has to grapple with how to jointly address often divisive legacy issues of the past and current issues. And progress in addressing child criminal exploitation as modern slavery and human trafficking requires that cross-departmental buy-in in Northern Ireland. And in Northern Ireland, that means reaching agreement across the political spectrum and continuing to press forward, even without ministers sometimes in place and without an assembly sometimes in place. And we do see that that does happen. On to the next slide then. When it comes to the legal and policy framework, we identified a range of promising aspects, which we've detailed in the report. But for the sake of time, I just want to briefly highlight some key barriers that we identified in the domestic legal framework. First, the Northern Ireland legislation doesn't have a statutory duty to identify modern slavery and human trafficking in force. So more accurately, the provision is there, but not yet in force. In the Modern Slavery Act, a similar duty is in force and is deemed satisfied in the case of an NRM referral or for adults who do not consent to that in the case of a duty to notify form being referred. Second, there are no consequences for a failure to make a referral. So guidance suggests that the referral of children into the NRM is compulsory, but with no duty or accountability mechanism, this assertion may not really have that much force. And third, we want to highlight the issue of how human trafficking is defined in domestic law. The inclusion of an element of movement in the definition narrows that international definition. The Northern Ireland legislation, the Modern Slavery Act, defines trafficking as arranging or facilitating travel of another person with a view to them being exploited. But we know that the Palermo definition and other international definitions have acts that don't require movement, such as recruitment or harbouring. We do see these acts listed in the guidance, but they're explicitly linked to an element of movement. Now, significantly, we don't see this in the Scottish legislation, which removed this travel requirement at the drafting stage. Problematically, our analysis found a focus on movement within this statutory definition and within NRM guidance may actually impact on how it's understood. Our survey data reveals movement narratives within understandings of both concepts of human trafficking and modern slavery. And the hyperlocal and familial nature of child criminal exploitation in Northern Ireland may actually shed light on this barrier of movement in a way that might not be as apparent in other settings, for example, where county lines exploitation particularly involves a lot of movement or travel. And so I'll hand over to Andrew to take us through some of the rest of the findings.
Thanks, Gillian. So on to the third finding, which we focused on knowledge and understanding. So among most survey participants in Northern Ireland, we observed a general good awareness of child criminal exploitation. Terms used to describe child criminal exploitation included themes of coercion, manipulation, power imbalance, and vulnerability, with several also acknowledging the newly agreed Northern Ireland definition. Data also indicated an awareness of child criminal exploitation as a phenomenon that has occurred for decades in Northern Ireland without formal recognition, despite there being legal and policy frameworks and support structures in place relating to child protection. And so, despite a general understanding of modern slavery and human trafficking among participants, and although not always connected, similar themes to child criminal exploitation were commonly used to describe this, including, again, coercion, control, threats, and exploitation of vulnerabilities. There were, however, some problematic conceptions of this issue, particularly in relation to the perceived need for movement, which Gillian previously outlined, with 77% of respondents referring to this when asked to define the issue of human trafficking. Additionally, many assume that victims of modern slavery and human trafficking in Northern Ireland are primarily women or female or foreign nationals, and others referred to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. So in general, many assume that child criminal exploitation may be hyperlocal. It might lack significant movement and is mainly, quote, a safeguarding issue for the local population. whereas modern slavery and human trafficking is often perceived as relating to foreign nationals or unaccompanied asylum-seeking children travelling internationally across borders. In terms then of the National Referral Mechanism, as previously discussed, the stark comparative figures between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK for children referred to the NRM. Our research reveals further challenges, but also benefits, potential benefits to the NRM. In general, there was a range of knowledge and understanding of the NRM, with 50% of first responders feeling confident to make a referral, as seen on the graph here, but also 50% feeling unsure or not confident at all to make an NRM referral. A key theme reflected was that the NRM would not bring any added benefit for those in Northern Ireland referred for child criminal exploitation. Several referenced existing support from social services without the need for an NRM referral. Some spoke of the NRM as a tick box exercise, or that it's only useful for those in an immigration process. Others felt that the NRM could also potentially be harmful, questioning how it could function in a post-conflict transitional society here in Northern Ireland with the threat of repercussion. In terms of benefits then, some suggested the NRM could be used as a data source to understand child criminal exploitation and the positive impact this could have on prevention and response, providing a wider picture of the issue and acknowledging trends in identification, types and locations of exploitation, which could then in turn allow for a more targeted response. Another benefit mentioned was the potential power of recognizing and understanding a young person as a victim rather than a perpetrator, and the role that victim identification has to play in youth justice and the diversion from prosecution, such as Section 22 of the Human Trafficking and Exploitation Act in Northern Ireland, which implements the non-punishment principle. So just moving on to the next slide, the fourth finding was capacity. So two key points arose in relation to capacity, namely limited resources, but similarly the strategic allocation of these available resources. Participants spoke of limited training to develop the knowledge and confidence of frontline practitioners to address these complex issues with resources already at capacity, and also the requirement or the need of specialised knowledge to submit an NRM and the training that is required to do this. And while there was acknowledgement of stretched resources, there was also mention of the need to then strategically allocate these resources through addressing this or these issues as a specialised practice, and we've outlined these more in the report.
So just moving on to the next slide, finally and briefly, we just wanted to highlight our fifth finding, that this research was undertaken during a time of movement and also momentum with our Northern Ireland institutions back in place, a new central UK government, progress on the CCE action plan, a new modern slavery and human trafficking strategy. We were very aware that as this research progressed, things were moving in real time. And in the context of this moving picture, there's a real sense of the opportunity that exists for Northern Ireland here to make significant, meaningful progress in addressing child criminal exploitation as modern slavery and human trafficking. And as you can see on the screen, interview participants pointed to this opportunity. Some spoke of the promise within upcoming changes and, saying, why wouldn't we grab that between both hands? As we move forward, it is, however, essential that we have clarity on ownership at sector, organisation and departmental level. And with that in mind, we want to just highlight some of the recommendations from this research. So moving to the next slide, the first recommendation is that the UK Home Office should explore, in consultation with key stakeholders, what regional modifications to the NRM might be required for it to function effectively in the context of each devolved region.
Just moving on to recommendation 2. We propose that the UK Home Office should consider resourcing an in-depth training and awareness raising programme, combining cross-cutting issues of modern slavery and human trafficking and child criminal exploitation for first responders and those who are likely to encounter child criminal exploitation across Northern Ireland.
Now, our third recommendation is for the Northern Ireland Government and Assembly, and we recommend that they should consider, first of all, amending the Northern Ireland anti-trafficking legislation to remove this travel requirement in the statutory definition of human trafficking. Also to consider progressing plans to introduce the duty to notify and slavery and trafficking risk orders in Northern Ireland, and should consider also introducing an accountability mechanism to ensure referral of children into the NRM.
On to then recommendation 4. We propose that the Northern Ireland Department of Justice should consider, in partnership with Departments of Health and Education, developing a modern slavery and human trafficking and National Referral Mechanism toolkit with expert lived experience input.
And our fifth and final recommendation is really to develop specialist expertise and also awareness raising and capacity for response. The Northern Ireland Departments of Justice, Health and Education should consider investing in child criminal exploitation and modern slavery human trafficking champions within regions, bodies and sectors. And so that brings us to the conclusion of this presentation. We're very happy to discuss some of the findings in more detail now in questions. So I will hand the floor back to Owen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gillian and Andrew, and I really appreciate your efforts to sort of distill such a long and complex and rich piece of research into really clear takeaways for everyone here today. And just to add, from our point of view, the Modern Slavery PEC, as one of the co-funders of this work, our thanks to you for leading the project, but also our thanks to the Northern Ireland Department of Justice for co-funding and co-commissioning this work with us. And that co-funding arrangement was a relatively new experience for us as a funder, and a really rewarding one that I think you've shown has led to some really innovative and impactful work. So lots of things to ask you about, and I'm sure lots of our participants are keen to jump in with their questions. So just a reminder, you can ask questions through the chat and we'll pick those up and pass them on to the speakers for you, or you can raise your hand, as some people already are doing, and we'll come to you so that you can unmute and turn your camera on if you want to ask your question in person. And we've already got a couple of people with hands raised. So could I please come to Titus first? You should now be able to unmute to ask your question.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Thank you. I'm from Kenya, at the border of Uganda and Kenya. I work with an organization called Busia Beyond Crime. We address issues of crime from human trafficking to terrorism and domestic violence and other gang crimes. Now, I will start with first a question and then elaborate on an issue. My question is this an issue that affects also or addresses problems of other global areas, or it is just confined to Britain? Secondly, I want to give you just a bit of elaboration on what we are doing on the ground to address child criminal exploitation, especially child domestic work. We use what in Britain or Northern Ireland you call neighborhood watch, where we map an area, we cluster in homesteads, because we are an organization that is based on the ground in the community. And the community are the perpetrators and the victims. So when we don't address issues pertaining to them, it becomes very difficult to handle this problem. So in the community, we have made sure that we build the capacity of the community through neighborhood watch.
I'm sorry to jump in and sorry to interrupt. We don't have a huge amount of time. I'm really sorry. I'm just wondering if we could keep questions relatively brief so that everyone has a chance to ask them, if that's okay.
All right, thank you. Yeah, we are using neighborhood watch, and it has addressed crime prevention, especially child criminal exploitation in this place. And it can be applied elsewhere, even in Britain. If maybe you could be given an opportunity to have an extended program, it works very effectively. Thank you.
Feel free to come in on that now, Gillian and Andrew, and then we'll move on to the next one. But yeah, I think that broader question of applicability of your findings to other contexts is a really interesting one. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, in terms of trafficking for the purpose of forced criminality, this is something that's very applicable in broader contexts. And I know that researchers, for example, in Spain, thinking of Carolina Villacampa, has looked at problems to barriers to identification in those contexts. And I think a similar thing is always that what is normalized is often not recognized. I'm thinking also of work. You mentioned that you live in Kenya on the Ugandan border. I've done some work in the past with the Refugee Law Project at Makerere University in Kampala. And again, thinking about things like forced marriage or early marriage in South Sudanese communities, that's often not recognized as human trafficking because it can be culturally a little bit normalized sometimes. And so I think depending on what is normalized, it's often not recognized. And I think we definitely saw that as one of our findings. And as I say, trafficking for the purpose of forced criminality is sometimes poorly understood, although I think that is changing. Andrea, I don't know if you wanted to jump in or add anything.
Yeah, I was just going to maybe add to that in terms of applicability, even within the UK. Our research focus specifically in Northern Ireland, which, as we can see from statistics and data, number of NRM referrals varies significantly from the rest of the UK. That being said, in Great Britain and mainly in England, there's a large number of children referred for county lines, which is something that is unknown or potentially not occurring as much in Northern Ireland. So there is definitely different forms that child criminal exploitation takes even across the UK and within Northern Ireland.
Great, thank you very much. Can I come now to Gareth with your hand up, please? And you should also be able to unmute.
Yeah, I've unmuted, and as you can hear, I'm a former Northern Irishman too. So I work in England now, and so there's just two questions from me really. Is that when you're talking about CCE, and then you're also discussing human trafficking, a real battle in mainland England is where CSA sits, so child sexual exploitation. And what I got a sense from what you were trying to say was, as part of the human trafficking the human trafficking perspective was that's where it sat. So I'm wondering, because again, in mainland England and Wales, we don't have a defined statement of what child sexual exploitation is, but we now have one for child criminal exploitation. But I don't see them as being very different in a lot of respects, because it's still the vulnerability things and the power and the abuse and the overarching legitimacy stuff that we've all discussed. So that's something that I want to ask about your recommendations is, are they seen as separate, or are they going to be included in the one overarching recommendation? So that's question one. The second one for me is the single competency authorities, so those who can do the referrals to the NRM. And of course, there's selection who can with local councils, with the police forces, so on and so forth. But one thing that I'm finding with my research is that there's a hell of a lot of third sector there, who are the ones actually engaging the community level, so on and so forth. So maybe that's something to think about when it comes to looking at where the training goes to also, and maybe perhaps even thinking about some of the community groups. I know there's quite a few in Belfast, for instance, who are able to engage with these young people in a way that no one else can. And also with the paramilitary background, of course, which is still very strong, whether we like to think it or not. These are sort of the hubs where these sorts of things come out. But saying that, so you mentioned earlier about the NRM. The NRM is extremely bloody hard to get through, to get anything through. And a lot of my colleagues that I discuss, across the country, a lot of the times, some of these single competence authorities just give up because they can't do it. But also the victims give up because of the length of time that it takes for something to go through the NRM. And then during that time too, they're more fearful, they're more alarmed, they're more worried about any repercussions. So, you know, it's just a suggestion, and perhaps the single competency authorities and also your training is going to support, you know, not just the number of referrals, but the understanding of what the referrals actually mean. If that makes sense. Sorry, just two big questions there.
Yeah, just maybe addressing to the first question firstly. So in terms of our research focused on the barriers to identification. So I guess the context of the research was that we had discovered through analysing NRM referrals that there'd never been a UK or Irish male child referred to the NRM in Northern Ireland since 2014 to the end of 2024. So, you know, colleagues in IOM UK based in London, you know, couldn't get their head around as to the, you know, thousands that are referred in England, Scotland, Wales, compared to never having any in Northern Ireland. And that is almost compounded by the context here that we outlined a little bit, the legacy of the past, the transitional post-conflict society, the continued presence of paramilitary. So in a sense, it's almost like a recipe where child criminal exploitation should be happening. And this was referenced quite a lot in stakeholder interviews that we had, that, you know, quote, it's a phenomenon that's been happening for decades, and there's a lot of policies, procedures, frameworks, and protection mechanisms there for children. So we were really looking to understand, why is it not being identified? Why is there maybe a disparity between child criminal exploitation and recognizing that as a form of modern slavery and human trafficking, which might be, you know, more so recognized in England? So yeah, we hope that the report has spoken to that. It doesn't specifically address child sexual exploitation per se, and maybe that's a piece of research for another day, but
another time. That's what I was getting to.
Yeah, but in terms of understanding, you know, knowledge, understanding, awareness, identification of the issue, this is what we are trying to really focus on. Yeah, and then maybe just in terms of the referral numbers, a lot of that I think we speak to in the third finding on knowledge and understanding, and how first responders and how they have the capacity to make referrals. I guess a lot of it focused on the perceived drawbacks and challenges of the NRM, and the capacity that first responders are already at, in comparison to then trying to justify or make a case for why NRM referrals are maybe significant or important. And there's a lot of, again, discussion back and forward around that. Gillian, don't know if you want to come in on that.
I've got a sorry, just 2 seconds. I've got a report coming out quite soon on a very hidden group, looking at how exploitation is understood within the Roma community. And with that too, one of the biggest things for me was voice. You know, so it's great speaking to the first responders. It's great speaking to the officials who are part of, you know, decision making. But I think also, you know, for another step is the individual voice, or the general voice of understanding what these things actually do mean. You know, because take Roma, for instance, as a, you know, a collective characteristic.
Sorry, Gareth.
There's no such.
I'm just going to have to jump in here, because
I know.
I can see a flurry of hands coming up, and we're rapidly running out of time.
Yeah, sorry, can I just jump in? I'm sorry.
On you go.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in very quickly on your CSE and CCE point and say that, you know, there's a lot of conversation around definitions, and we in this report talk about and show how actually the human trafficking definition can encompass this kind of activity that constitutes CCE. It's the same for CSE. And so something I wonder is if we're better to use definitions that we already have and help people to understand how this kind of harm falls within that scope. That's something for a slightly different day, but it is related to our research a little bit. And I'll hand back to Owen now, because I can also see a flurry of hands.
I want to squeeze in a couple more questions before we finish, if we can. So there's one from the chat that I'm going to pick out because it builds on the previous question, and then we'll see if we can get one or two people whose hands are waiting before we close. So, interesting question in the chat on the number of first responder organisations, and the question of, should more organisations be first responders? And I guess that goes to the point of, what would it take to build trust in the NRM and get people to be more comfortable using it? So any quick thoughts on that? And then we'll come to a couple of people who are waiting.
Yeah, I mean, happy to jump in and say, sorry, you can join after. I was going to say, I know I think there's two ways of looking at this. One is that we build capacity in people to become first responders. The other is that we build capacity in people to understand who the first responders are that they can be in touch with. Because one of the things that came out of our research was that this is a very highly specialized process. It's quite legally complex as well. And so I think there's two different ways of looking at that. That's maybe comes in a little bit with the whole champions recommendation. It's knowing who to go to and when to go to them. So I think there's two different ways of looking at that, but building capacity one way or the other. Andrea, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think in Northern Ireland we do have quite a number of first responders, ranging from statutory and non-statutory first responders. In the report, we've outlined specific first responders and the amount of referrals they make, so would recommend to have a look at that. And as Gillian said, I think it is super important to address capacity issues and an understanding of the issue. And when you can build capacity of first responders, they're more inclined maybe to understand the benefits, how to do it, streamline that into their processes.
Brilliant, thank you. There are 3 or maybe even more than 3 people waiting, and I apologize in advance if we don't get to everyone. Maybe what I'll ask is if we could take 2 questions, if I could come to Grant and Patricia, and if I could ask you to be as brief as possible, with apologies and with your understanding, and then I will ask Gillian and Andrew to be as quick as you can with your responses to those, and see if we can fit anyone else in as well. As a Grant first, please go ahead.
Yeah, great. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, fine.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation, Andrew and Gillian. I'll try and keep it quick. I have my own interest in researching this area from the Scottish perspective. One of the aspects I'm particularly interested in relation to victim identification, barriers to identification, and I wonder if you'd had any sort of looked into this in any way, shape or form, is thinking about the actual legal process itself. So I've currently been working on thinking about the Scottish approach versus the English and Welsh approach, because England and Wales, much like Northern Ireland, has a defence through the Section 45 defence under the 2015 Act. Scotland doesn't have that. Scotland doesn't have any defence for victims of trafficking. Instead, they rely on prosecutorial guidelines. And so I've been thinking about how those different stages in the legal process, in terms of how dealing with victim identification at different stages can have a profound effect. And I wondered if that was something you'd thought about or might think about in the future in relation to Northern Ireland, obviously with a biased perspective here, because I'm interested in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grant. And Patricia, if we could take your question as well.
Sure, absolutely. I've got a sort of a broader question, really. I guess in post-conflict societies, there's quite often a lot of issues around trust. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how this sort of panned out in the Northern Ireland context and in relation to this research in particular. And a sort of a sub-question really is, you said it's been happening for years but not recognised. And I wondered why now is a good moment for these stories to come out, and now is a good moment for this categorisation of the sort of coercion, etc., to be called human trafficking.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm looking at Andrew here. I think I'll jump in and then you can go. In terms of the Scottish defence, we didn't look at that so much. Where we looked at the Scottish legislation was how in the definition section. I'm aware that the Scottish criminal justice system is quite unique in the context of the UK, and I certainly don't purport to be an expert in that. But I think you raise a really interesting point, Grant, which is broader than just the defence, which is what does recognition of victimhood do for our understanding of crime? And I think, whether it's Scotland or whether it's Northern Ireland or whether it's England, going back to these kind of international obligations and the non-punishment principle. The non-punishment principle is clear, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, that, where someone has been exploited, they should not be held criminally responsible. where there's a direct causation. I mean, when we look in the European context, that's maybe a little bit narrower, but there's at least this obligation to consider not imposing penalties. I think we have a long way to go there, and I think we have a long way to go even in terms of NRM referral and how that links in with the use of the statutory defence. I think it'll be very interesting to explore that further, and a whole of UK approach. So maybe that's another another way we can, a lot of thoughts are pinging off in my mind about that. I think it's something that we didn't have time to go into in great detail, but we also realise that there are particular challenges in Northern Ireland with using that defence, and Andrew might want to speak about that a little bit more. I'm just conscious of time. In terms of trust, Patricia, and then why now is a good time. I think trust is something that came through, and we maybe problems with trust, something that came through in the main report in terms of people being a bit afraid. Sometimes, where there are definitely safeguards in place, given Northern Ireland in that hyper-local context. And I think trust is maybe something, or I would maybe call it confidence. We maybe need to have things in place that would give people confidence that this is a secure process, because there are some perceptions that I think would hold people back. In terms of it being recognised, and why now is a good time, I think it's always been recognised in some sense as exploitation, but maybe not as child criminal exploitation, modern slavery and human trafficking. But then sometimes it hasn't been recognised because it's been normalised. So I think now, why now? I'm not sure. I suppose why not now is my answer to that, rather than to have any profound answer to that. But I also think, we are 27 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, and we are at a point in the legacy process where maybe now is a good moment to say, let's start calling some of this stuff what it is. Andrew?
Yeah, I was just going to come in briefly, conscious of time as well, on the first question. And we did have a few conversations with those involved in the legal process, and solicitors and so on as well, and especially in our Q&A in the event that we did. And a lot of people would say, like, if you bring a young person into a police, or if you're brought into a police station with a young person who's caught with a significant amount of drugs in their possession, this solicitors or those in that process would say, you got 30 minutes to build their trust, and for them to persuade them to say they're a victim rather than someone who's a perpetrator and carried out the crime. And that is compounded with the paramilitaries in Northern Ireland who have significant community control throughout a lot of communities in Northern Ireland. So there's a real difficulty, I think, in doing that, and the processes maybe there in terms of using that in Northern Ireland Section 22. Then in terms of the why now, I would say I'd also maybe give credit, to the Northern Ireland Department of Justice, and as well as the Departments of Health and Education in pushing this forward in terms of the Child Criminal Exploitation Action Plan, the agreed definition, and also really taking this research proposal forward and pushing that conversation throughout Northern Ireland as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. It's always a good sign when we run out of time to field everyone's questions, but I know it's annoying if you've been waiting, so apologies for that. But do drop your question into the chat if you haven't had a chance to ask it, and we will collate those, pass them to the speakers afterwards, and do our best to follow up with you on them. In the meantime, thank you so much, Gillian and Andrew, for your presentation. Thank you again to Northern Ireland Department of Justice for co-funding this work. And thank you to everyone for joining us today and for your really excellent, insightful questions. We do ask you to fill out a very, very short feedback form. It takes no more than 2 minutes, and it's really helpful to us if you don't mind. We'll drop the link into the chat right now. And then finally, if you told us when you signed up for this that you were happy for us to contact you in future, we'll add you to the Modern Slavery PEC newsletter mailing list. You can also sign up for that directly via our website, where you can also, if you're interested, join our Google group mailing list, which is worth a look if you're active in work in this sector. So thank you very much, everyone, again for joining us, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you again at our next lunchtime seminar in due course. Thanks very much.